Hey guys, Jawad here with Hit the Apex podcast. Thank you for joining me for another week of exciting podcast content. How's everyone doing? I hope everyone is well. This is my first full week of I wouldn't call it isolation because I can still go out and have a walk, go grocery shopping and all that. But I guess, yeah, a workless week this week, the first one. So far so good. I haven't lost my mind. Kept myself pretty busy. And as I said, there was heaps of things I was planning on doing anyway in this time that I would not be at my real life physical job. So got started with the racing revisitations articles that I'll be working on in this time. So I had a look back at the 2010 F1 season to start off with and published the first part of that. Second part, hopefully, I'll have up there tomorrow. The photos as well, as I said, done a bit of that and mainly just cleaning around the house. I busted out the steam mop this morning. That was exciting. After a pretty fun podcast with Dino on the Regen podcast. We were up early for this one, a little earlier than I would have liked, but just for the time differences and everything, it all worked out. So, I guess I'm getting too used to getting up at 9, 10 a.m. every morning, whereas normally I'd be up at 6 anyway to get ready for work. So I'll talk a bit about the 2010 F1 season on this podcast, bit of the E-Series as well, supercars. It's become kind of a Wednesday night tradition now, and some other media as well, which seems to be what's happening usually on this show. Last week it was all about Star Wars, bit of music as well, but getting into Netflix, new series on Netflix, The Last Dance, which I mentioned on Regen podcast as well, which you can listen to when it is available. So, kicking it off, I guess, looking back at the 2010 F1 season. So it was quite enjoyable watching some of those races, watched the season review, did a lot of in-depth reading, stats and all that sort of fun stuff that I'm sure that everyone really likes to spend their days looking at. I even busted out the notebook, the little A5 notebook, which I haven't written in for maybe a while, easily over a year now or 2 years. So took, quite a few pages of notes for what I was going to compose, and then ended up with 3,500 words, and that, is being a bit selective as well as far as how I'm going to go it. Like, it wasn't, I wasn't trying to do like a race report all in, 20 or 19 race reports in one big article. It was more like, okay, so this is how this has affected the ultimate outcome of the championship, or, him, not finishing this race is going to have adverse reaction for the rest of the year, or this guy had a bad first half of the season, but in the second half he's really come back. So it kind of all comes together as one cohesive narrative. So hopefully if any of you guys have read it, you've enjoyed it. And then part 2 coming out too as by Friday, hopefully. Anyway, it was the 60th championship season for F1, so given that this year we were supposed to be celebrating 7 years, it's a decade ago now, and it's kind of hard to believe that 2010, such an exciting season, was that long ago. It shows how much has happened in between there. We've had that big change of regulations going over to the hybrid turbos, and then of course evolution of that with the aero package in 2017. So quite a lot has happened in the meantime, and we've had drivers come and go as well, so seeing names that you don't see on the grid anymore in 2010 was interesting. Even guys like Kamui Kobayashi or Sebastian Buemi, who've gone on and done bigger and better things in sports cars and Formula E. Jaime Alguersuari, who's musician now. Adrian Sutil, I guess, who knows what he's doing these days. Same with Tonio Liuzzi. So a lot of guys there on the grid, you see them make their debuts or you see them as prospects and then they kind of disappear into nothing. So I guess that's kind of the beast that is motorsport, not just F1. You can be the hot thing one moment, but then next you're not. And it just shows you how tough a game it is to survive. So, yeah, close title race as well, 4 points in it at the end of the day, at the title decider in Abu Dhabi. Sebastian Vettel, of course, winning the first of 4 World Championships, 4 in a row too. Who would have thought that would have been the start of that little Red Bull dynasty that they've had there. And, of course, the Constructors win that they had in Brazil too. So Red Bull and Vettel winning 4 back-to-back after that. Got to say, though, coming into that year, you wouldn't have picked Vettel. I mean, this is just based off my memories 10 years ago. I wasn't really looking at Sebastian Vettel as someone who I would have picked for the championship. Kind of typically you go for the more experienced hands. So by the time we got to Abu Dhabi, it was, okay, Fernando Alonso, he's in the best position here. And Mark Webber, he, given his experience over Vettel, you would have picked him. But then Seb just slipped under the radar, basically, ended up winning the whole thing. Wrong strategy decision from Ferrari's part, and also for Mark Webber, who, started 5th in the race, so he was already on the back foot while his teammate was on pole. And Alonso, he only needed to finish on the podium or something like that to be champion, because he was leading the standings when they came into the final race. So they kind of just lost it with that pit stop, I think, reacting to Red Bull's pit stop for Webber rather than keeping their eyes forward and saying, okay, we've got to shadow what Vettel does. So as a result, the infamous 2010 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, where you had Fernando Alonso hold up behind Vitaly Petrov in the Renault. That's another name that dropped off the grid in a few years after 2010. It was good to see him on the podium in 2011, the Australian Grand Prix. So it didn't come to nothing, his short-lived F1 career, but I guess Petrov will probably be more remembered for holding up Alonso and to an extent Webber as well in that Abu Dhabi race. So yeah, that's how it all got lost for those guys, and for Alonso especially, and after that it was kind of, he came this close, and, we'll probably see him do it again in next year or the year after or whatever. But then we all know how that panned out. 2011 didn't really come together for Ferrari or for Alonso, and then 2012 it was just basically Alonso versus Red Bull and the rest of the grid. Him taking a dog of a car to finishing within 3 points of the championship at the end of the season. So 2012 is probably his best season as a driver, but 2010 as well, he had all the pieces there to win it. But I guess a weak first half of the season could be, I guess, you could blame that and say, look, he should have been winning more races early on. We saw him come out and win in Bahrain, the first race of the year. Then it went all the way to Germany before he won another one. And you can argue that the Germany win was kind of manufactured, because that was the scene of Fernando is faster than you. Felipe Massa having to move aside and let his teammate through. I mean, Alonso was quicker anyway, so he could have probably found a way past him, but rather than go through the effort to actually do it in a racing situation as you would expect, they just said, oh yeah, Felipe, get out of the way. So, Ferrari typical with their team orders and everything. But the second half of the season was a lot stronger for Alonso, back-to-back wins in Monza, then Singapore, then the race in Korea as well, which was one to never forget, where you had Webber crash out, you had Vettel crash out as well, and it was basically the race that potentially killed Red Bull's championship. Well, it killed Mark Webber's championship because he made the mistake there, and he could have easily had the points to put him in a bit of better position for the final race in Abu Dhabi, which he didn't. Vettel, unfortunately, didn't score either in that race. I think he retired 10 laps from the end of the race with I think it was an engine failure or something. But he got the job done in Abu Dhabi when his rivals faltered. So you got to say that he was the better driver in that situation. But yeah, Alonso, he was on it in the second half of the season. You could say the only mistake that he made in the second half of the season that he made, not his team, was Spa. So Spa ended up retiring DNF. That proved costly towards the end of the race when it was a bit wet and slippery. So he, like Webber, made a mistake at that race. Webber in Korea, of course. So that could be attributed to Alonso losing the championship, but then, so can the pit stop in Abu Dhabi and being stuck behind Petrov for the rest of the race. So, and Yas Marina traditionally is not the best circuit to overtake at the best of times. So, they should have taken that into account. But, what's happened has happened. And whereas Alonso now, still stuck on 2 world championships in F1, unfortunately, and burning relationships with engine manufacturers too. So that's a whole other story if you want to talk about Fernando Alonso and Honda and how that stopped him from other opportunities in the world too, especially IndyCar. That's that one. So what was more intriguing about 2010 was the face of the title race kept changing almost race by race. So you had Red Bull, who were fast in qualifying, raising a lot of eyebrows, of course, with the clever little things that they had on their car at the time. This is sort of the beginning of the blown diffuser situation, and McLaren had their own F duct as well that was helping them get out in front in the races. But Red Bull were fast in qualifying. I think they had like 6 poles or 7 poles in a row or something, all the way from Bahrain to Turkey, and then Canada was the first race that Red Bull wasn't on pole. So between Webber and Vettel, they were really quick. Then McLaren probably better in the races in the first half of the season at times. It seemed like they just threw away certain situations. So, we had Jenson Button master the wet conditions in Australia and China. But then second half of the season completely came away from him, and him as well just has a very limited window where he can get to grips with a car, which is a bit annoying at times because, the car might be a quick car, but he just can't find the right window to get a good, comfortable setup for him. And that's probably cost him, numerous good results at times. I remember 2012 as well. There was a lot before, I guess, McLaren's development direction changed and took a turn for the worst. I think even Button's just ability to get the car on the sweet spot was a little bit challenged. And at times, of course, Lewis Hamilton, still young then and with 1 world championship from 2008, he still had a lot of his insecurities as well, which, came from, the team making certain decisions as far as, strategy was concerned, or favouring Button over him. So Button, of course, it was his first year with McLaren, reigning world champion from Brawn. But, Australia was an example of that, where they pitted Hamilton close to the end of the race while he was catching Button and he was in third. And that cost Hamilton a podium position. But at the end of the day, they say that the tyres were fading too much and they had to pit him. Otherwise, he could have come under threat anyway. So that was one of those things. And yeah, you look at Hamilton back then and you look at him now and say there's a big difference. I mean, it was a quick driver who won in 2008 and won the championship, but what we've got now is like a complete package. He's wise, he's quick, he is just one of those drivers that you got to say, wow, greatest or one of the greatest of all times. Then for Red Bull, it was kind of up and down in the first half of the season with their races. You had the highs of the Monaco Grand Prix, 1-2 finish, Mark Webber victorious there, to the lows of the Turkish Grand Prix at the next race. So, the start of where, basically the beginning of the soured relationship between the two guys when they were together at the team. Of course, that's all different now, as we've talked about on the podcast a long time ago. But yeah, the incident in Turkey, it was like Vettel had nowhere to go. Webber, was he in the wrong? Did he kind of close the door on Seb? Stuff like that. It's been debated, talked about a lot. And then, of course, Mark being in a unfavourable position there at Red Bull, where, Red Bull wanted to favour Vettel. God, Verstappen would have been like 1 year old then or something. I know that's not true. When Red Bull wanted to favour Vettel, Helmut Marko was very vocal about it as well. So, that basically was the beginning of the souring in their relationship. And then, of course, what happened at Silverstone with the number 2 driver jibe. So, Webber ended up winning the race, or before the race actually. Vettel crashed in practice, and then in qualifying was given the updated front wing that actually was on Webber's car, and because Vettel had crashed and damaged the other one, ended up giving it to Seb, which made Mark very happy, of course. And he kind of gesticulated it in the press conference, slammed the glass of water on the table. I think the team are very happy with the decision that they've made. You could cut the tension with a knife. It's like knife through butter. It was that palpable. And then in the race, I guess Mark responded the best way he could. He went out and won. Seb, of course, getting tangled with, I think, Hamilton at the start or something, and ended up getting a puncture. So Webber winning the race. Not bad for a number 2 driver, he said on the team radio, and he still drove a really good season. I think it was Webber's best season for Red Bull, and arguably the best chance he had to win a championship. 2012 was a different story because Webber kind of just dropped off halfway through the year or went into Vettel's court. But 2010, where it was kind of still on an equal playing field between the two until the middle point of the season, and even after then he was still on the podium and stuff like that. So yeah, Webber's best chance to win a championship, I think, in 2010. And then you had other kind of highlights of the year, the new teams that didn't really do much. I mean, I said in part 1 of the article that in one of the first practice sessions in Bahrain, you had Timo Glock in the Virgin racing car had its wheels come off, and it was kind of a metaphor for what was going to happen with those 3 teams. Virgin, of course, became Marussia, and then Mana Marussia towards the end of its tenure. You had the Lotus team owned by Malaysian group, and then they became Caterham, and of course the Hispania team, her HRT, and they only lasted, I think, 2 more seasons after that. So it just goes to show you that it's a tough game to get into F1, and just being underprepared or whatever is not going to cut it. So I guess the way Haas have done it, when you look at more recently a new team coming in, it's probably more safe to do it that way. But even that, like, a lot of people have questioned their model and said, they haven't built their own car. They've basically just gone to the shop and bought pieces off the shelf or whatever and just put it together. That's it. So there's that part, but then also, if you want more teams, you're going to have to find a sustainable way to run a championship to allow teams to compete and to compete fairly as well. And I guess a lot of the discussion at the moment as well with financial crises being upon a number of sporting organisations all over the world, or just organisations all over the world, ways to drastically reduce costs in Formula One, because given what's going on and how money is being lost by the hour or whatever, or by not going racing and that sort of stuff, they're going to have to find a more sustainable way to do this, and to find a budget, to cap the budget as well. They said $175 million. Perhaps they've got to lower it given what's happened now. So that's all food for thought anyway for what's going to happen next. But going back to 2010, it was good to see some new teams on there, some new drivers, even though they weren't, I guess, the most impressive. But then we had guys like Nico Rosberg, the 2016 world champion Nico Rosberg back then, who was still very much in the early part of his career. He joined Mercedes, of course, taking over from Braun GP that year, and lured Michael Schumacher out of retirement as well. So Rosberg pretty much showing up Schumacher that whole year, or even in the first couple of races. Like Rosberg ended up on the podium 3 times, which was good, and we all kind of had our eyes on this guy. It's like, this Rosberg guy, he seems pretty good. And then little did we know that he would end up partnering Lewis Hamilton from 2014 and dominating F1 for the next few seasons, or until now. But Rosberg retired, of course, after his title success in at the end of 16. Robert Kubica as well, another guy who really starred that season, making the switch to Renault, of course, taking over from Fernando Alonso, and getting 3 podiums that year as well, which was really impressive. And unfortunately, that was, where Kubica had that meteoric rise after 2010. There was that big fall too, with the terrible career, or almost career-ending accident that he had in rallying. And we find out afterwards that there was a contract for Ferrari on the table as well, that he would have partnered Fernando Alonso there at Scuderia. But what could have been, with Robert Kubica. So that was one of the sad stories to come out of the end of that season, heading into 2011, because I'm sure his presence would have been great on the 2011 grid. But that's just the way the things that work, I guess, unfortunately. And Schumacher as well, just terrible. It wasn't a 7-time world champion that we had on the grid. It was like, well, what the hell's going on? And Hungary, with that incident with when he almost put Rubens Barrichello, his old Ferrari teammate, into the pit wall, was like, wow, that's very amateurish. And Rubens himself was like, does this guy have a death wish or something? Does he want to try and get me up there? Pointing to heaven or referring to the heavens. So yeah, it was not the most impressive return for Schumacher, at least in 2012. Like 11 was again very, very average or below average. At least in 2012, he got the podium. He got the phantom pole position, of course, because he had a grid penalty to take, so he actually didn't get to start the Monaco Grand Prix on pole. But it was a bit better than the other 2 seasons. So, and of course, thoughts are always with Schumacher as well, with whatever situation or whatever condition he's in at the moment. 2013, late 2013, that skiing accident that he had. It's just, kind of forget about it, or you don't really talk about it much, but then you do have it in the back of your mind that this has happened and this is the situation. So, hopefully Michael is still fighting, and whatever condition he is, we wish him very well. So a very memorable season was 2012, and quite fond of it, actually. I think it was it? No, 2009 was probably the first season that I watched fully, like, watching every qualifying, watching every race, just intently. I was always keeping tabs on the races before or not watching them live. And I think from 2010 is when I watched, I haven't missed watching a race live since 2010. So that's my little personal brag for this week. It's nothing to be very proud of. It's not. I was talking about it with someone a couple of weeks ago. We're like, that's not at all a pickup line or anything like that. So yeah, don't worry, I'm not gonna break that one out or anything. So I've watched every F1 race since 2010. I've watched them live. Yeah, no, that's not very impressive at all. It just means I've got nothing better to do getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning for the Canadian Grand Prix, mind you, which is on a public holiday. So that's all good. It's the ones that are in the US at the end of the year that are a killer, especially Brazil, because it's kind of in the middle. It's not, it's not fully morning like what I deem to be, 6 a.m. where I normally get up and get ready to go to work. It's like, okay, it's at 4 a.m. So either I have a very early sleep or I sort of have half a sleep and then have another hour's sleep after the race and then get ready to go to work. But who knows what that's going to look like this year. Have no clue at the moment. Anyway, what is going on is a lot of E-Series racing, a lot of esports, which is good. Talked about supercars, still going to talk about supercars because it's the only one that's doing it right. And I talked about it on Regen podcast with Dino earlier today as well. I think he seemed pretty impressed by the product as well. Hopefully he gets to watch some more of it. They're going to have round 4 next week. It's on every Wednesday, which is good, getting into this regular schedule that it's on. Get around the TV, or you can watch it on Facebook or whatever, and it's just there. So this time we had wildcards. We had Simona Di Silvestro, who of course up until last year was racing with Kelly Racing in the Nissan factory team. She left at the end of last year to return to Europe. Of course, reserve driver for Porsche in Formula E. We had Will Power as well, of course, the 2014 IndyCar champion, Indy 500 winner for Team Penske, wildcard for DGR Team Penske, and of course a couple of Super 2 stars in Thomas Randall and Brody Kostecki, who are quite prolific, I guess you could say, with the sim racing. And Thomas Randall apparently unveiled a facility or a business that he's been working on, where you could go and do like driver training in a simulator, with full movement feedback and everything. So that seems really cool. And Brody Kostecki, he was on it straight away. Like, he qualified on the second row of the grid in the top 10 shootout. He missed out on the race 1 win to Shane van Gisbergen, but then seemingly won the race, the third race of the night, at the final corner, with Scott McLaughlin going off. But Craig Baird, the driving standards observer, ruled that Kostecki made contact with Scotty, and as a result gave Brody the penalty, and Scotty was declared the winner. So Scotty, of course, still on top of the standings. A bit of what comes around goes around, because Scott got penalised in, I think, the first race where there was 4 drivers trying to negotiate the chase, and Scott kind of went off the track and put one on Will Power, and I think as a result Andre Heimgartner was involved as well. So that was a bit of a sad story, kind of a flashback to 2016 Bathurst with what happened with between McLaughlin, Jamie Whincup and Garth Tander. Whincup punts McLaughlin off. McLaughlin's off, cuts through the chase and tries to rejoin. Whincup, meanwhile, has decided to slow down to let McLaughlin back in front of him, but then Garth Tander arrives at full pelt, who Whincup didn't see in the mirror, and then as a result, all 3 kind of crashed together at the same time. And God, it was heartbreaking at the time, because I'm like, oh, this could be the year that McLaughlin wins in the Volvo. The Volvo in its retro livery is going to win the race, but it didn't happen. And also I was rooting for Garth Tander too, because it was going to be his last year for the Walkinshaw team with HRT, and they had won Sandown earlier that year as well. Got that photo of him and Luffy on the podium, which is a good one. I posted it ages and ages ago, back in 2016. So if you follow me on Instagram, where I post all these racing photos, you're going to have to trawl through all my photos to find that one. So yeah, between Tander and McLaughlin unfortunately being punted out of the race, it was a bit unfortunate. And then of course Whincup got the penalty for it, and in the end it was Will Davison and Jonathan Webb that won for the Techno team. So good race that. As always, Bathurst is thrilling, and as we saw in the E-Series as well, it's it's just Bathurst. It's just the place that makes racing interesting. So even with sim racing, it was chaos, it was carnage. But then at the end of the day, it was really good racing, and we saw some good results. Fabian Coulthard won the reverse grid race as well, which was the second race of the night, and then of course, McLaughlin winning the third race. We learnt as well this morning, actually, that for next week's race, which will take place on a couple of American circuits, I forgot which ones they were, but hopefully Watkins Glen is on the roster. I really love that circuit on Forza Motorsport 7, and especially in a supercar, I really love doing the first couple of corners in the V8 supercar, so hopefully Watkins Glen is one on there. But Joey Logano, the NASCAR champion, he's going to take part. We've also got Alexander Rossi coming in as well, which will be great. And of course, he drove Bathurst last year, the Bathurst 1000, as a wild card for Walkinshaw and Andretti United, and that's part of a ride swap or a virtual ride swap that he and Chaz Mostert are doing. So Chaz is going to actually go and race in the IndyCar E-Series this weekend, and Rossi will come over and do supercars next week. So it's really gaining a lot of traction, which is good to see. And Will Buxton, again, the F1 reporter, or the F1, you don't need to introduce him. You already know who Will Buxton is. Such a great guy. Love his content. He tweeted saying that, need to get Scott McLaughlin to come over and do the F1 E-Series or whatever, the virtual Grand Prix, to which McLaughlin replied, I think something like, hell yes, or whatever. So that'll be interesting to see McLaughlin try that out. And just with Dino before on Region, we were talking about, or he asked me, is Scott McLaughlin good at everything he does, or does he win anything that he touches? And this will be the test, that if he can jump into the F1 virtual series and come out with a win or a podium or a good result. So we've already had one supercars driver go over and do that a few weeks ago. That was Andre Heimgartner. So high profile entry like McLaughlin, that would be really cool. And McLaughlin, just again, absolute star of a driver, gun of a person, and really making a name for himself worldwide. And Lando Norris, he's going to be doing the IndyCar E-Series as well this weekend. So maybe supercars can try and lure Lando. I think I said this last week, try and lure Lando into doing to racing a supercar. That would be pretty cool. I know a lot of people out there who would be really interested in seeing that. So that's kind of the only live racing we can really commentate on at the moment, is the digital virtual stuff. So going really well. And quickly, while we're on that, I just remembered that today MotoGP, the new MotoGP game came out as well. So I haven't got my hands on it just yet. I think it's not complete as such. They haven't actually put the championship mode in there because there's no championship at the moment. So I think they want to wait till something starts before they patch it in or whatever. So I'm not really keen to pay for an incomplete game at the moment. But it does look really good, like graphics-wise. It looks, I think the last MotoGP game I bought was the Valentino Rossi game, which was 2016 or 2017, I think. And, it seems like what I've seen so far, the previews, is that the graphics and everything are a big step forward. So I'd love to get my hands on that at some point and play. I mean, I'm still playing F1 2019 in career mode up to the Belgian Grand Prix, so I want to try and finish that career mode, or just finish the first year of the career mode, win the championship, and then maybe do the F2 championship as well, because there is an achievement that I want to unlock before we move on to F1 2020, which was announced last week. I didn't talk about it on the podcast, even though it was announced before I went on air, but yeah, it was going to be like a tribute to Michael Schumacher this year, the 70th year of the championship, and of course with an array of Schumacher vehicles. So they got the Jordan that he drove his first race, a couple of his Benetton cars, which we haven't seen Benetton before in the Classics mode, and a couple of the Ferraris that they didn't already have in the game too. So always excited for a new F1 game. And in career mode, you can actually now create your own team, so you will be in charge of the 11th team on the grid. Get to choose your chief sponsor and your engine supplier, and of course, you can race with your own team against the grid of 20 drivers and the existing 10 teams. So I think that'll be an exciting new addition. It's like stuff that you would dream of having in an Ultimate F1 game, but of course they can only add so many new things every year. So that, I think, is coming out in July, so still a fair way away. Found it interesting too that they're bringing back split screen mode, which, I'm more of a split screen person than playing online multiplayer. I mean, I just find it a lot more fun if you have someone else there in the room with you to play like that. It's just what I'm used to, growing up playing 4-player split-screen Mario Kart on Nintendo 64, or even, split-screen Forza Motorsport, Gran Turismo, to playing split-screen Halo on the Xbox. So it's just what I'm used to. I don't really do play much online unless it's a shooter these days. The racing stuff, I just suck. And this is where, when you hear critics of esports, or is particularly sim racing, saying, it's so easy, I mean, anyone can do it, kind of thing. It's like, actually, no, it takes a bit of skill. I don't consider myself any good at it, but it's hard. Like, if you want to be on the same lap times as the real drivers are, or the pro sim racers are, and I haven't actually done, I think the most sim game that I ever played was like Gran Turismo or something. Project Cars, I haven't played iRacing before. I want to get my hands on Assetto Corsa when that's available for Xbox, because I don't have a gaming PC. I've just got a laptop which, barely can do Adobe Premiere and all that sort of stuff, so I can't really do any of the PC things. But even if I did, and let's say I had a budget, went out there, spent a couple of $1,000, built a sim kind of thing, it would take ages for me to be able to get into the same zone as the pros are. So for anyone who thinks that they could step in and do what they do, I'd like to see you put your money where your mouth is, because I don't think it's that easy. I mean, someone like Jamie Whincup, for example, who is a 7-time champion in supercars and the real thing, and he's struggling with doing sim racing. Again, he struggled at Bathurst yesterday, so not the easiest thing in the world to do. So I don't think any of the criticism is fair. As I've said before, what separates sim racing from other esports is that sim racing is actually the closest thing to the real thing than all the other stuff. So games like FIFA or your PC, MMORPGs or whatever, that form a lot of the esports or the arena-based shooters or whatever, that's all done by gamepad or controller or keyboard and mouse, whereas the physical input with, steering wheel, feedback, of course, and then, even brake modulation as well, like you can actually tune your brakes or whatever or brake pressure and all that sort of stuff. So it's very in-depth. So I'd like to see anyone who wants to criticise sim racing to give it a go for themselves before they have a go, or say, it looks easy, I could do this with my eyes closed. I would like to see you guys have a go. So give it a go. I'm going to come out and say, I've already said it, that I suck. So probably need a lot of fine tuning before I can do that. And I purely at the moment as well, with the limited amount of wheel options for Xbox that are in my price range as well, it kind of rules me out of giving it a go. Like, I've got I managed to pick one up secondhand, Thrustmaster Ferrari, one of the Thrustmaster Ferrari ones that don't have force feedback. It's just horrible. Without force feedback, it's just, you can't even use it because I used to have a Logitech force feedback wheel which I was using for PlayStation and PC when I was playing the F1 games on PC. So that was my kind of foray into that sort of thing. But for Xbox, I just haven't been able to get my hands on a proper wheel with force feedback. And if I did, then would be a start to try and begin practicing this sort of stuff. But I've kind of hung up the cape there for now, and just sticking to the gamepad, see how we go. Be interesting to see how Assetto Corsa plays with a gamepad. I'm sure it's not recommended, but I'll give it a go. Unless I end up getting gifted or something, or they have a sale on steering wheels and I'm able to get an entry-level force feedback wheel for the Xbox, so that'll be interesting to see. Anyway, moving it on now. So as I said at the top of the episode, that I started watching that series on Netflix, The Last Dance, done by ESPN. There's only 2 episodes available because they're going to release them on a weekly basis every Monday, I think it is. And what it centers around is the 1990s Chicago Bulls dynasty. Of course, one of the greatest sporting teams of all time, as many people will profess, whether you like basketball or not. They're just one of the most successful teams, period. They won 6 championships across 8 years, so they did it in 2 3-year or 2 lots of 3. They were able to do it, 2 3-peats, as they say. And the actual story for this series, as well as looking at the rise of Michael Jordan through college ball, and of course through to getting drafted to the Chicago Bulls in the early part of his career, and the players around him, so like Scottie Pippen, of course, who is the best number 2 available, Dennis Rodman, the enigmatic guard that he was, forward, enigmatic forward that he is, and all the other guys that were around him. It was good to see guys like Steve Kerr as well, who of course is the current head coach of the Golden State Warriors. The relationship between Phil Jackson and the front office, of course. Phil Jackson, one of the most successful coaches in NBA history, winning, of course, the 6 rings with Chicago, and then, of course, another 6 with the Lakers. 5 with the Lakers. He's got 11 in total. My basketball history is a bit dusty, so that's why I'm enjoying watching the series, because it's allowing me to learn new things about the NBA and about that particular time and everything as well. So what the series predominantly focuses on, I guess, is the kind of the end of that era. So the last dance, as Phil Jackson said in his playbook, heading into the 1997-98 season, of course, the last dance for the Dream Team, kind of the fallout between Coach Jackson, of course, and the front office, so the general manager Jerry Krause, who's kind of portrayed in this as a bit of a villainous character, even though from all accounts he's not. He's meant to be, or he was meant to be, a nice person, but it was just his kind of, he got a bit of small man syndrome when the Bulls started getting successful, and they were attributing it more to the team and to the coach rather than to him. And he, given that he as the general manager is the one who built the team, he got the players to surround Jordan when in the 80s the Bulls were pretty woeful, and Jordan pretty much was carrying this team on his back. I mean, it was interesting, and I think it was the first episode where you hear about a bit about that background, and Jordan came into this team as the rookie, a clean rookie at that as well. He wasn't involved in partying or drugs or drinking or anything like that. And he recounted how he went into one of his teammates' hotel rooms, and the rest of the team were all in there. They were all doing coke and had girls in the room and everything. Whereas Jordan sought to avoid all that to try and keep a good image, but also he wanted to be the best, and being the best meant that he had to keep a clean attitude, a healthy attitude, training as well very intently, and you saw a glimpse of this in episode 2 in the 1986 playoffs when they do a flashback to that. And even though they lost to the Boston Celtics in the first round, a Boston Celtic team with Hall of Fame players everywhere, guys like Larry Bird and Bill Walton and all that. So against them, they lost, but Jordan had 2 sensational games that they portrayed in the show. And it was like he did that all on his own. And in the second game in particular, none of them could defend him. He was just unstoppable. But the Bulls still lost because, of course, they didn't have the team around him to do that. And that's, of course, when, after that, Krause started recruiting other players. So Pippen came in from, I think, Seattle. It was Rodman as well. They got in, so they started building a team around him, and of course Phil Jackson being the integral piece as a coach too. So far in the 2 episodes, it's been pretty intense. We've already had a lot that's occurred, a lot that I've learned as a result of watching it, and of course the end game, I guess, is the fact that they win that 6th championship, but how they get there with Scottie Pippen being injured at the start of the 97 season, and they talked a bit about this in episode 2 where he could have got his surgery for his injured leg straight after the previous season ended, but in a bid to try and, I guess, negotiate, like his kind of negotiating tactics, because it was the last year on his contract, and he was being severely underpaid for being one of the second best player in the NBA at that stage. He decided not to, and as a result, that kind of saw him get stuffed around by Jerry Krause, and of course there was a lot of exchanges between the two. So Pippen actually hurling abuse at Krause, which was not warranted at all, but it just became so sour and so toxic in that organisation, and that eventually, I guess they all did disband at the end of it, but not without the success. So what Jerry Krause's ambition was, even though he is known for being an enemy of Phil Jackson or whatever, just they don't like each other or whatever, he thought that, at the end of their 5th championship, that this team is getting too old. They've got to look to rebuild. But the team, the guys like Michael Jordan, Pippen, Phil Jackson, they were like, well, we could still win another title. So we got to win as many titles as possible. Whereas Krause has this long-term vision that, okay, this team is getting a bit too old. We got to start rebuilding, and rebuilding doesn't happen within a year or 2. You've got to build your draft picks and all that sort of stuff, usher in new talent, and it's a weird cyclical thing, the NBA, that you'll have patches where teams are really good, of course, and this team dominated for more than half a decade, and then it stopped and it changed. Then I think the next team to really get a run was the Lakers, again with Phil Jackson as coach in the early 2000s, and then again at the end of that decade, Phil Jackson and the Lakers with Kobe Bryant and everything. So it's a very cyclical thing, NBA, and this is where I'm kind of looking at all the list of champions and how they end up. There's a lot of one-hit wonders or whatever who win it once and then the next year they'll have a bad year kind of thing. So the really good teams, of course, are the ones who win back-to-back or three-peats or win a whole bunch in a short amount of time. So I got to recommend it. Anyone who's a sports fan, or if you're a basketball fan, I'm sure you've already watched it because it's been all over my Twitter feed this week. So I'm sure there's a lot of people out there waiting for the next few episodes to come out. But even just as a sports fan, it's a very good fly-on-the-wall style documentary. Of course, they've got the unprecedented footage access from 97-98, so stuff that's been unseen since then, since when it was recorded, and of course now they've put it all together and got it ready for viewing. And I'm sure it was supposed to be released a bit later, but given that we've got no basketball on at the moment, or any sport as a matter of fact, it kind of was brought forward, the release, to make sure everyone's satisfied, and I think, got quite a few people who are. So yeah, really looking forward to the next few episodes and learning a lot more about what happened back then. So yeah. Well, I guess that kind of wraps it up then for this week. So I think, I'm going to be... This is the hard part, is committing. Very, very non-committal at this stage. But look, I said it last time or a couple of weeks ago that I may even look to switch to a bi-weekly schedule, or a fortnightly schedule, so podcasting once every 2 weeks kind of thing. So I'll leave it till next week to decide. As always, I'll drop a line on Twitter if I'm not going to, but otherwise you will hear from me. But yeah, just so there's more to... I mean, it's not like there's a shortage of things to talk about. It's just, whether it's worth coming on and doing it every week or not, kind of questioning that a little bit at the moment. But I really enjoyed doing it this week. I really enjoyed going on Regen. So, of course, if you guys don't know who they are a Formula E podcast, electric racing. They cover Dino and Chris. Chris unfortunately couldn't join us this morning on the show, so hopefully he'll be back on Regen sometime soon over there. But yeah, you can follow them on Twitter as well, at Regen E-Racing, I think it is, something like that. Sorry, Dino, if I didn't get your handle right on Twitter. Yeah, or at Regen Racing. There you go. So I was not too far off. Follow those guys and listen to their podcast, because it is really good, and I'm really grateful to have those guys as friends of my podcast as well, and for us to be able to appear on each other's show and talk about whatever it is we like. It's really fun. So check those guys out, and of course I'm available on it at Hit the Apex Media on Twitter. So be sure to check that out and see what I'm up to as far as ramblings and musings are concerned. Anyway, that's it for this week. So take care, guys. Remember, practice safe social distancing and all that sort of stuff. Wash your hands, and I'll see you guys soon.